Hello, friends, and thank you for tuning in to the Cross-Pollination podcast. As usual, you have timestamps in the description of the YouTube version of the podcast to help you navigate it easily, and you also have audio footnotes at the end of the conversation that contain the books and the research that we refer to, as well as corrections and clarifications. The footnotes are indicated by this sound. So, today I'm talking with Jason Haaheim. I'm going to try to keep the superlatives to a minimum, but I must say that his story is truly exceptional, and I'm glad that he accepted my invitation. Jason is the principal timpanist at the Met in New York, so that's the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, and he is a former nanotechnologist. He's on faculty at the NYU Steinhardt School of Music and at the Bard Conservatory. He is the creator of several seminars, including the Deliberate Practice Bootcamp. Today, we are discussing the principles of the science-based, efficient and effective practicing that he outlines and advocates in his blog, which, by the way, I cannot recommend enough. His experimental and rigorous approach to musical practice has allowed him to become part of one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world, despite not having studied music performance at the graduate level, and despite working in a totally different field, which is something only a handful of people have achieved. He has discussed his background and his ideas before on other shows, and while this episode has value on its own, in my honest opinion, it's best consumed after having listened to one of the earlier podcasts that he did. The reason for that is that I made an effort to ask him new questions and to steer the conversation in a different direction than what has been done before. I can recommend listening to the Musical You episode that is very thorough and constitutes a good complement to what you're about to hear. All the relevant links are in the description of the YouTube version of the podcast. As I said before, I also strongly invite you to read Jason's blog in chronological order. I read each article several times, and I must say that he does an excellent job of progressively explaining the principles of applying deliberate practice to one's life. He also uses a lot of pop culture analogies, and it seems that our tastes in books and movies are overlapping quite a bit. And actually, he makes a subtle The Big Lebowski reference in the podcast, which is one of my favorite movies ever, and I wonder if you'll catch it. One last thing before we start. I've discovered something while I was preparing this introduction, and I'm really kicking myself for not knowing it before, because I would probably have mentioned it first thing on the podcast. But apparently, Jason created the smallest portrait of Homer Simpson ever. It's 10 micrometer large, and it was quote-unquote painted using dip pen nanolithography. I put a link in the description if you're curious to see it for yourself. Okay, that's all for me, so here we go. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Mr. Jason Haaheim. Okay, so my first question, as well as the first few seconds of Jason's answer, were not recorded. But thankfully nothing of substance was lost, and I'm just going to reread my question for you here. Hello Jason, and thank you for being here. You are very adamant on your blog that to practice effectively, it is necessary to continually refine one's process. So to say it differently, it's necessary to practice. And you state that deliberate practice is and should be hard, and in fact you describe it as an excruciating joy, meaning that it's often not pleasant in the moment, but that it's deeply rewarding in the long run. You also have this article on your blog called Unless Your Phone is in Airplane Mode, you are practicing like a Nazgul. And besides, you mentioned the fact that you're interested in ideas like deep work or digital minimalism that you use to approach practice holistically. As a musician, it's relatively clear that the hyper-connectedness of the world we live in can have adverse effects on the quantity and on the quality of our musical practice. And that's why I would like to have your thoughts on digital hygiene. Okay, so that's my question. At the beginning of his answer, Jason starts by considering the relationship between humans and technology through a historical lens. And that's the rest of his answer.
Human history, in terms of how humans are sort of being required to interact with technology and how that impacts our lives and our work processes. And, you know, with my background as a trained scientist, I will be the first to cheerlead a lot of the benefits of technology, right? So on the one hand, nobody can disagree with or doubt that, you know, in general terms, sort of capital T technology has had a huge positive impact in, human civilization, standards of living, all of this stuff, curing diseases, blah, 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 right? This is not arguable. On the other hand, it is also equally true that we, as a sort of species, and then, societies as parts of that, have always had a difficult time figuring out how to incorporate new technology effectively, and how to do so in ways that don't really disrupt or negatively impact our lives, right? And you could find examples of this all throughout history, but looking at the sort of mid-19th century Industrial Revolution and how European cities had no idea what to do about coal burning and the smog that took place, and they've now, in the past several decades in London, spent all of this time and money cleaning up the facades of all of these old buildings that were polluted by the impacts of the early industrial age. And so this is all a way of saying that we now have these devices in our pockets that are truly some of the most powerful double-edged swords in the sort of technological development of human history. And it has some very specific impacts for how we try to practice and how we try to go about music. The couple books that you mentioned, I alluded to them in a recent post, and I haven't really written about it yet extensively, but I've noticed that there is a growing I would say sentiment and sort of train of thought among a lot of writers and academics and intellectuals, in the United States, and then certainly worldwide too, of people who are looking at these early impacts of new technology and trying to figure out, like, what does this mean and what is this doing to us, and what are the pros and what are the cons? And the specific book you mentioned, Digital Minimalism, by the author Cal Newport, it's one I read over the summer because I was really interested in this question. Because for myself, I had, throughout my own auditioning experience, I had beneficially incorporated a lot of technology for myself, which had the impact of amplifying my efforts. It made me more efficient. It made me able to do more in less time. It made my practicing better. It made my learning better. But I've also seen some really, really consequential downsides of this. And Cal Newport's book put as fine a point on it as really anyone has yet that I have read. And it's sort of obvious in retrospect, but the thing he stated very concisely was that the sort of new incarnation of the internet, which is to say everything sort of after the advent of the smartphone, we have this enormous economy now with companies like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Apple, Google, just the litany of tech companies out there who have figured out that you can monetize attention. And what I mean by that is that Cal Newport has this very kind of profound thing he talks about in the very beginning of the book, which is to try to understand the definition of solitude. And it seems like it's getting a little too far afield or abstract. I promise we'll tie it back to music and just...
No, absolutely. Actually, I read it myself, and it's probably my favorite part of the book. So I'm following you completely here.
Wonderful. So he talks about how we define solitude and what that has meant at different points in human history. And he kind of starts off by saying, a lot of people would think naturally about defining solitude as being physically alone. Right. Like the classic Thoreau, Walden Pond, sort of go off in the middle of nowhere and just be by yourself.
Yep.
But in the age of the smartphone and ubiquitous Wi-Fi, that's really not enough, because you can be physically by yourself and utterly, perpetually distracted constantly and unable to think straight. Mm. By contrast, you can also be in the middle of Times Square in New York City. And if you are, sufficiently focused and concentrating and, wearing earplugs and noise canceling headphones and just you find your own little spot to sit and meditate, you could define that as solitude. And so what he does is define solitude as freedom from input from other human minds. And the combination of that idea, along with the thing he draws our attention to in the book, which is to say that whether you like it or not, whether you've consented to it or not, you are now part of an economy that monetizes your attention. And your attention, your focus and concentration are an economic quantity that is being basically taken away from you without your knowledge, or oftentimes without your awareness or your consent. And so a lot of the rules he talks about in this book, and pointing back to your question of digital hygiene, are guidelines for how you can start to take that back and how you can establish boundaries of technology for yourself to use the positive parts of it and not fall victim to the negative parts of it. How you can create spaces in your own life to embrace solitude, because I think one of the things, I haven't explicitly written about this yet, and this is not, frankly, when a lot of the people were doing the research on deliberate practice, smartphones didn't even exist yet. And so we're only starting to see how totally destructive these devices are or can be for the solitude that's required for deliberate practice. And I think, any musician worth their salt will recognize immediately that, it is really impossible to get productive practicing done when you're in a distracted state. Okay. Now couple that with the fact that we live in this new economy where a distracted state is the norm, and actually something that a lot of very sophisticated companies are trying to keep you in all of the time. And you've got a pretty toxic combination. And so it's basically on us to push back in these individual ways and establish good digital hygiene.
Yeah, fair enough. I feel it's even worse for my generation and the generations that followed, because a lot of us are YouTube musicians, and so there is this depth versus breadth problem where you have 1,001 different videos that you can watch that will teach you this and that, but you never have time to it can seem to a young musician that you don't have time to sit and actually practice, because there is so much to see and to experience, and maybe you don't know what practice should look like yet. So it can be a very alluring trap. And that was another question I wanted to ask you, actually, that I called Bruce Lee and the 10,000 kicks, because Bruce Lee said that he doesn't fear the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but that he fears the man that has practiced the same kick 10,000 times. So I wanted to ask you, maybe that's a bit extreme, but I wanted to ask you about strategies, practical strategies that one can enact to allocate one's time and attention to, on the one hand, discovering new ideas and taking advantage of the internet, and on the other hand, taking some time alone to practice these ideas and allow them to cross-pollinate with other ideas that one might have.
Yeah, all really good questions. So maybe the best place to start with that is some of the practical guidelines, in a way that Cal Newport talks about. They segue right into how you adapt this for your practicing and how you navigate this problem of depth versus breadth. There's a couple basic ones that he talks about, which is just, right in line with the kinds of things I've written before. Like, don't keep your phone with you in the practice room. Like, it is a device designed for maximum distraction. And even if you follow his guidelines, which I recommend, which is like, take all the apps off of your phone that you don't absolutely need, turn off notifications, all of these general things. The device itself, it still exerts a measurable psychological pull that is distracting you and taking up mental bandwidth. So that's one aspect of it. And I've written about how I encourage students to, take an old phone that's basically dead. It's not connected to the internet. It's not connected to anything. And you can still keep your tuner app on there and your metronome app and all the other useful tools, but absolutely delete and disable everything else. And then, it can be a tool that you use proactively and with intention. And in a way, it's that same sort of mindset of focused intentionality that I think needs to govern the way we interact with the internet and the way we interact with what is essentially infinite content. Because you're right, an individual now, a young musician in the year 2020, has the ability to sit at their laptop or on their phone and peruse YouTube every minute, every waking hour of every day and they would still have more to learn. And so clearly there has got to be some sort of framework for saying, okay, I'm not going to learn everything. Like that is not possible, nor is it even necessarily beneficial or helpful. I want to learn the things that are relevant to me, to my values, to my process, and ultimately toward the trajectory I want to be defining. And if you actually just sit and write down for yourself what those things mean and what they are, you can start to be a lot better about enforcing and sort of self-policing, so that you don't, spend 3 hours on some deep dive down a rabbit hole where, yeah, you might have watched a bunch of funny videos, but like truly do like hamster singing and 4-part harmony have anything to do with what you're really trying to do to refine your craft, right?
Yeah.
I think also, right. So there's the Bruce Lee idea of, yeah, that's the depth part. Like you want to practice something and get really, really good at that thing. Now, of course, it's not, his is a simplified analogy because in music, we don't just have one kind of kick. And obviously in the martial arts, you don't have one kind of kick either. But his point remains that like you decide a thing that you really want to improve and you do that and you try to not get yourself too distracted and pulled away by all the other infinite sort of myriad variations of different mixed martial arts and dancing or in music. I want to learn a new instrument, or I want to learn, how to compose in, 12-tone serialism, or, whatever, right? Like it's a totally endless field. And so at some point you want to decide like, yeah, this is kind of my thing. This is what I want to be doing. I think the problem is that can be really difficult, especially now, especially when you are, I'm sort of using the royal youth, the mass of people, possibly young musicians that are out there kind of struggling to find their place and trying to figure out, what is your thing? What is it you want to be doing? And I firmly believe that this is not a process that can be rushed, nor can it be faked. And what I mean by both of those is that I think a lot of people will say, they'll be like 12 or 13 years old and they're like, I know for certain that I want to do X, Y, and Z for the rest of my life. And, as much as I applaud that kind of ambition and self-knowledge, and while it may be true in rare cases, it's usually not, right? Like it's really difficult when you're, in your mid-teens to have the kind of self-knowledge and sort of self-possession that's required to make these kinds of big long-term commitments, right? I certainly wasn't, not remotely. And to a certain extent, I mean, this is actually verging into territory that you didn't exactly ask me about, but it is, I think, related to the range versus, or the depth versus breadth idea. And, that is that it is also, I think, difficult. It's certainly, I know, more this way in Europe than it is in the United States, where you are asked at an early age to basically make these decisions and then stick to it, right? I know a fair amount about the European, especially the Northern European education systems where, you end up taking these tests when you're 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 that are sort of deterministic for, okay, well, you're going to be, now you're on this track and now you can't really change tracks, or, okay, you have to decide when you're 14 and you're going to be a musician, or you're going to go to trade school, you're going to go and do, physics or whatever else it is, right?
Yep, and I can also attest to that. Maybe the UK would be the notable exception, but definitely in France and Germany, and especially in Germany, you have that for sure.
Yeah, Scandinavia too, to a certain extent. I'm working with a few students there. And I mean, I don't have a lot to say about that other than I think what we are experiencing is that so you can sort of set up this system where back in the day, and I'm talking about 60, 70 years ago, like pre-computer era, you were, any individual person was exposed to so much less that it was just a lot easier to decide what you wanted to do, right? Like you didn't have this like existential problem of self-discovery and self-determination, when if all you knew was, ranching out in eastern Wyoming, and that's what your family did, and that's what everybody did, and that's just what you knew, like it was easy to make that choice. Some would argue that, well, that was not really fair to the people back then because they didn't know what they were missing, and maybe that's true. But I think on the other hand, we're living through almost the paralysis of too many options. And in a way, what the internet affords young people, especially in Europe, is seeing the sort of endless cornucopia of things you can do and be, but you're asked to make decisions about that before you're fully mature, before you're like anywhere near adulthood, and before you have, again, the sort of like emotional maturity to know like what it is that truly interests you, and what you're going to be able to sustain the kind of energy and willpower in for the many, many years it takes to really achieve mastery in a thing. And that's tough. And I think I don't really have a specific prescription for that other than to be aware that that's a problem. And for myself, the way I dealt with it was that I didn't go to a conservatory, right? Like I needed a liberal arts experience where I could go and get breadth. I wanted that for my education. You mentioned in one of your previous emailed questions this book Range by Epstein, right?
Yes.
And I think it's interesting because some people point to that work and point to his book and some of the statements in there, and it's tempting to sort of say, well, no, this is a complete repudiation of the idea of deliberate practice. You shouldn't focus on something. What you need is range and breadth. And I read all of that, and I was reading about the book and what he wrote in it, and I was like, wait a minute, no, not at all. These things are not mutually exclusive. They're not antagonistic at all. Like, I think what it is chronological. For me, and I think for many people, breadth precedes depth, which is to say, you get exposed to a lot, you learn about a lot of different things. This helps inform your worldview and make connections among different ideas and different disciplines. And armed with that, and then comparing it to your own sort of sense of identity and your values and what you see that you want to contribute, you start to make decisions about what it is you're going to go really deep on. And I think that regardless of the educational system you're in, regardless of Europe versus US, regardless of liberal arts versus conservatory, there is this basic dynamic that can helpfully and sort of healthily exist, which is to say, breadth precedes depth. Don't rush to depth if you're not sure about it, right? I think the consequences of that, we see them all the time, right? Like, especially in the US, our American orchestras have people in them where, they had parents that were really, really pushing their kids to go into music. And, basically from the age of 5 or 6 saying, okay, this is what you're going to do. This is what our family does. You're going to be a musician too. You need to go practice and do all this. And, with sufficient sort of tyrannical helicopter parenting, like, you can force a kid to get really good at an instrument, like good enough to win a job. That certainly happens. I think the problem is that, we also see it's not very sustainable, because people get in there and they realize, like, wait a minute, I didn't ever want to do this in the first place. And then, they're adults on their own, and they have landed in a place that they didn't get to through their own volition or without sort of defining their own agency in the process. And then things can get really complicated. And I think that's why you see certain examples of, people.
Crisis.
Yeah, sort of, maybe a midlife crisis, maybe an early life crisis, but anything where they're like, oh my God, forget all of this, I'm dropping everything and going back to do something completely different. And and it's also, in a way, it's ironic for me to say this, because I think some people that don't know me or don't know like the context of my story would say, well, wasn't that what you did? Like, you went into this one field and you totally jumped and did the other thing. And my answer to that is actually no. It was much more linear and sort of seamless than that. Like I pretty early on in the process, I knew what it was that I wanted to be doing. I knew what it was that sort of my values and my process were urging me to do. And then it was just a matter of actualizing it. And then that takes time. And the only sort of exceptional difference was that I managed to have a day job, right? All musicians get to a point where they're out of school and they have to pay the rent somehow. It's just that mine happened to be at a nanotech company and not like Starbucks. But yeah. but my sort of my guiding principle remained the same, which was I want to do this if I can, and there wasn't crisis involved in that.
Yeah, well, it's really, I'm really grateful to be able to hear your answer to that question, because I was really wondering how to reconciliate maybe peak and range. And actually your story sounds a lot, to me it sounds like the anti-tortoise and the hare, in the sense that you really took your time to, in some ways, to figure out your why and why you wanted to go into field. And that's the first article on your blog, if I'm not mistaken. And then you started to run faster and faster. You talk about 3 different inflection points towards your goal, and that worked for you. So it's really interesting how that is in direct conflict with the idea that we have, that you have to start early and hard, and that is going to take pretty much the same amount of time for everybody, and that you cannot really work on the F prime, if I can say, that you can only work on putting in hours, and that an hour is an hour and stuff like that.
And, I love that you said F prime, because it's exactly right. I think what a lot of those sort of adages or true, sort of pseudo truisms or received wisdom, like what all of that stuff is getting at is not exactly wrong, but it's again, it's an incomplete picture. It's not the full story. Like, it is true that getting an early start can be helpful, but that's really proxy for saying is that it takes time, and it takes smart time. And what that neglects is that, like, exactly then where you start is not as important as putting in that time, but then actually doing it really smartly. Because if you do that, somebody who practices really efficiently for 2,000 hours can achieve far more than somebody who practices really inefficiently for 20,000 hours, right? And that's exactly the F prime concept you're talking about. Mm-hmm. This is, for any listeners that are not hip to this jargon, we're basically talking about calculus, but it's trajectories and slopes and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's the way I see it, it's in one hand, and that's actually the question I want to ask now. What I called in my email the dull axe dilemma, because it's like, how much time do you spend actually practicing, and how much time do you spend practicing practice? Like, how much time do you spend refining your craft? So metaphorically, it would be, how much time do you spend hitting the tree trunk versus how much time do you spend sharpening your axe? And I don't know if the metaphor really holds. I don't know if you do both at the same time, or I would like to have your ideas on that.
Yeah, another very excellent question. And in fact, so here I am going to pause because there was a quote about this that it's going to take me about 20 seconds to find it, but it's directly relevant. In Cal Newport's other book that I read this past summer, December 2019, this is his book, Deep Work. And on page 216, he actually gets into and documents this concept that I've written about a little bit and also discuss extensively in masterclasses and talks when I give them, because I think a lot of people, they sort of naturally look at my story and again, the sort of trajectory involved, and they're like, well, wait a minute, like how is that even possible? Like, you had a full-time job at a nanotechnology company, like you were a titled, principal scientist person, and you were going around and giving talks on that, and had this fairly demanding job at the same time that you were like playing in the civic orchestra and auditioning and freelancing and doing all of this stuff. Like, how is that even possible? And my response to that has always been this exact same thing that Cal Newport cites, which is that tech workers, like people who work in offices, in cubicles, and with computers, they might be physically present in an office 8 to 10 hours a day, but they're not doing nearly that much work in a given day. My estimate was that in any given day, my coworkers and colleagues at the company were doing about 2 to 3 honest hours of work. And the other 7 to 8 hours were messing around on social media sites and hanging out and chatting at the water cooler and going out to a long lunch and, just all of this other stuff, which is not bad. And to be clear, this is fairly universal. I mean, this isn't just the tech sector. This is finance. This is marketing. This is advertising. This is like everything.
Yep.
And what it really points to is that most people are just really, really inefficient with their time. They're not focused. They're not disciplined. They're not really consciously aware of how they're spending it. And so it tends to just get wasted in all sorts of different ways. And so what I did for myself is I thought, okay, well, if all it's going to take is about 2 to 3 hours of really focused work time for me to keep up and or exceed like what the rest of my colleagues are doing, I can do that and still have 7 to 8 hours a day left over for sharpening my axe, right? So the idea was I was going to put in the maximum amount of actual practice time a day that I could, which, as I've written about, is, I think, increasingly understood to be governed by some pretty hard and fast physical limits, right? How much you can sustain focus and concentration, how much this may or may not relate to the biochemistry of myelination, some of these other things. But, we all know that like practicing 3, 4, 5 hours a day is a lot. And then beyond a certain point, it's just diminishing returns. And this is, all the more true for brass players, where you can really start to hurt yourself if you're blowing too much in a given day. So all of that being said, I was basically challenging myself to say, okay, you can practice as much as possible every day, and you're still going to have a lot of time left over. So use that time really effectively to sharpen your axe. Which is to say, your initial question, I would argue, was a flawed concept. It was a flawed premise that you have to choose between one or the other. It's like, no, it's both, right? You put in the maximum amount of practicing, and as long as you can be efficient and disciplined with your time, you'll still have many hours a day to go about this task of, I like the analogy you made, sharpening your axe and really improving your process so that the time you spend in the practice room with your instrument is the most efficient it can be.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying that actually you are spending as much time as you can just completely focused on your instrument, and once you're not burnt out, but once you're reaching the point of diminishing returns, you stop, and the other hours in the day are used for normal activities and also sharpening your axe, thinking critically about practicing, and so on. Is that right?
That's basically it, but it's not like one and then the other. I mean, it's very much interleaved, right? So, for example, before I won the Met audition, my daily schedule would be something like I get up at 5:30 or 5:45 in the morning, have some coffee and a light breakfast, practice for an hour, take a 10 or 15 minute break, maybe do some quick stretches or something like that. Do another 45 minutes or hour of practicing, and then go to work. And I'd be at work for 8 to 10 hours. And in that 8 to 10 hours, I would have, again, 6 or 7 of them available to do the axe sharpening. And the axe sharpening could range, anything from listening back to some of the recordings I made from the practice session that morning to listening back to and transcribing the lesson I had with a really good teacher, the week previous. It could be listening back to the mock audition I played with a group of people a couple of days before that. It could be, listening to 20 different recordings of the same symphonic, portion for an excerpt that I'm studying. It could be score study. It could be reading more articles about deliberate practice. Right. I mean, again, the sky's the limit there. And it's whatever I was, focused on doing that was going to make my time in the practice room better and more impactful. And then I would get home from work and pick up where I left off and say, okay, I've done this other stuff. I've, gotten even more refined in my process. I'm even more targeted in what I'm doing now. Now I'm going to practice another couple hours, make dinner, and chill out for a few hours in the evening. And that would be a day. So it's not one or the other. It's a lot more sort of interleaved and interspersed.
Okay, well, that's much clearer. Thank you. I would like to maybe change subjects a little bit and ask you questions about the social aspect of deliberate practice. Actually, I don't know if it's in the talent code or in talent is overrated, but I read this statistic that I think I will link it and find it correctly, but it's something like competitive runners have on average 4.1 brothers, big brothers or big sisters or something like that. And so there seems to be this component of emulation and sometimes of competition that takes place between people. And besides, you also mentioned the book The Rest is Noise by Alex Ross, in which he describes couples of frenemy composers. And in general, people seem to be more driven by immediate competition rather than by long-term goals. And in the same vein, Eric Weinstein makes it clear that, in his opinion, it's very important for one to find his or her own arch-nemeses. And so I'd like to have your thoughts on this subject, the collective aspect of deliberate practice.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing is that this stuff all revolves around the same basic idea, which is that virtually all of the deliberate practice research at this point across a variety of different disciplines points to this thing that the researchers in various ways call the supporting environment. And the supporting environment is essentially everything else beyond you, your instrument in the practice room, that you are cultivating and sort of architecting to enhance your project, which is your process and your trajectory and everything else. And I think all of the different examples you cite are sort of different manifestations of how that can work. But one of the, I think, underlying kind of caveats or admissions, I suppose, in all of this is sort of being honest with ourselves as human beings, which is to say that we can aspirationally hope to do a great deal, and we try to make plans, and it's a good thing that we're often really optimistic in all of this, and then reality intervenes, and then it's a lot harder in practice to get stuff done on time, or learn as much rep as you had wanted to, or get as many practice hours in before this audition as you were hoping, and on and on and on, right? And to be clear, like that never ends. Like I still struggle with this on a daily basis in my position at the Met. And so what the supporting environment accomplishes is a variety of sort of safeguards. It's almost like checks and balances, guardrails on our behavior and our decisions to keep us as positively focused on our sort of original intentions as possible, right? And sometimes, in the example you mentioned, it can be identifying an arch nemesis, somebody with who you can compete, so that it's like this competitive drive is what is fueling you to get more work done, right? Now, I think there are pros and cons to that approach. I think it can vary by discipline and by field, but to be perfectly honest, I mean, one of the things I try to encourage my students to think about is getting away from this idea of competing with other individuals, because so much about, I think, high level music performance and the sort of related performance psychology is recognizing that you're really only competing with yourself, right? In a given performance, in a given audition, you are going in there to do your best job, and you're not really so much worrying about what other people are doing. You can't control that. Certain sports frameworks can be useful in making this analogy, right? I think the idea of the arch nemesis is like for tennis aficionados, Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer, right? These are two, incredibly skilled tennis players who continue to see themselves in, the quarter and semifinals and finals of, the Wimbledon and US Open and all this other stuff. They are competitors directly, and one's performance impacts the other. And at the end of the day, it's a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think music is like that. Music is a lot more like golf, right? You're going out there and you're just trying to do your best, and you're not directly interacting with the other people against whom you are sort of quote unquote competing. And so again, I think the arch-nemesis thing is variously useful in different contexts. What I do think is a lot more relevant to musicians is this notion of like, yeah, runners coming from families of other people who do this. It's exposure, and it's an environment that creates a lot of incentives to do the right thing and creates disincentives to not do the wrong thing, right? And to a large extent, like as musicians, we get this in school. School is sort of our first major supporting environment where you are now surrounded by other reasonably like-minded individuals who have similar goals and with whom you can, share ideas and practice strategies and musical insights, and you can socialize with them, and you can be sort of an emotional support network and all of this other stuff. And that is really, really essential. I don't know of, major examples of people who were able to make incredible progress in a discipline without having that sort of environment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple interesting parts of the same book, Deep Work, that examine this idea, because there's this sort of like there's the myth of like the isolated mad scientist, that like you get somebody who's just like so completely dedicated to their thing. They go off to an island and they live by themselves for 10 years and they come back and they've cured cancer or something, right? And like that doesn't exist. You know what I mean? Like that's just never a thing that's happened. And what he talks about in the book is that people have looked for this. They've tried to find case studies like, okay, can we find somebody who has learned an incredible amount and, really made substantial contributions to the field and done all of this sort of like a solitary monk on top of the mountain without interacting with anyone or cross-pollinating or having the supporting environment? And the answer so far is no, they can't find examples of people who do this. Now, of course, there's a subtlety to this, which is you need both. You need, again, it's sort of like the idea of breadth and depth all over again. You need a network of people. You need a supporting environment that you can learn from, rely upon, interact with, get inspired by, learn from in a sort of amplifying context. But then you also need, obviously, a lot of solitary time by yourself to just go do the work. And, composers like Mahler and his frenemy Strauss were, great examples of this. Mahler had his little composing hut in the woods, in the mountains, but he was also like very much a man about Vienna, and he would interact with other people, and he was conducting, and so he had both the breadth and the depth going on. And that was what was kind of fueling his project.
Okay. I have a bit of a maybe more practical and slightly different question now. Going back to Epstein's book Range, he has this idea of wicked environments versus, I think, it's straightforward environments or something along these lines. And so maybe it's just my ignorance of the field, but it seems to me like, for example, being an orchestral musician is more of a fair environment in the sense that you have to accomplish something that is fairly specific. And for example, at an audition, you get direct feedback. You know if you passed or not. And so I'm wondering if you have any ideas for musicians that are in the fields like, I don't know, for example, jazz playing or stuff like that rely much more on nebulous ideas and concepts, maybe a bit more of a wicked environment where you don't get straightforward feedback. I'm wondering if you have advice for these people and how can they apply your principles, for example, of journaling or building on feedback and so on.
Yeah, I think it's a really fair question. I mean, I think I have a couple of sort of initial thoughts on this, and then I'll elaborate. The initial thought is nothing changes. It's still all the same basic dynamics and mechanisms. You just have to, kind of craft your approach a little bit differently because things are obviously not as straightforward, right? Just like you said, winning an audition in a blind audition process in a U.S. orchestra like the Met is a much more straightforward thing. You send in your resume, you show up, you play for a committee of 12 or 13 people or whatever that's behind a screen, and they either vote for you or not. And at the end of it, you either won or you didn't, and you hopefully can get some feedback and then go on to the next one. Fair enough, right? And it's especially concrete if the feedback you got was you were rushing and you made mistakes and you were playing out of tune. Like that's objective stuff. That's not like, oh, I didn't like your interpretation. And then there are other times where you may, be in the finals for something, and the comments you get are like, oh, all the finalists were really, really good. Like they all had different things to say. And we just sort of felt like this other player kind of matched our like artistic personality a little better and was just a better fit. Okay, like fine. There's not so much you can do about that. Move on to the next one and hope the stars align there. I think where it obviously gets a lot more complicated is the kind of thing you're talking about, which is certain kinds of freelancing. Certainly if there are, the world of composing is a whole different animal there. People who are sort of mixed composers, performers, who are sort of, charting their own path in this 21st century, internet identity environment where it's all about maximizing exposure and all of this other stuff. That is a lot more complicated. It is not, the rules of success are sort of not as straightforward, obviously. Nevertheless, I still think that the same basic process applies, and it, no matter what, it's got to start with, we'll find some people who have been demonstrably successful at this and ask them what they've done and ask for their advice, right? Mm-hmm. In a way, this is no different than for, decades, for hundreds of years, human beings thought nobody could run faster than nobody could run a mile in faster than 4 minutes. And that was just assumed. And then Roger Bannister did it, and everybody was like, oh, crap. How do you do that? And so people started to ask him, like, well, oh, you trained differently. You trained smarter. You had a different approach to this. Oh, you wore this kind of shoe. Oh, okay, And then you get some insight, and then it turns out other people are able to do it too. It wasn't just that he was, genetically gifted or something. It was about his training and his approach and his process. And so I think regardless of, wicked versus unwicked environments or the degree of wickedness involved, it's still about, finding examples and, emulating and adapting what they're doing. In sort of the same way as the supporting environment, the very related concept is that, like, nobody gets there on their own. Like, nobody makes real progress without having teachers and mentors along the way. Nobody should be ashamed of seeking out mentors. I mean, that's really what this is all about. Like, you should want that and need it and be proud of doing that. And, like-minded mentors will be happy to do that. Right. I think there's a lot of joy in learning that teachers get from the process too. And so regardless of the environment, again, whether it's, jazz vibraphone or spectral composition or, busking in the subway or like whatever it is that your thing is, like isolating and identifying the people who have been really successful at it and then saying, cool, so how'd you do that? Like, what advice do you have for me?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there will be no way to completely shelter oneself from selection bias, maybe. But that's where there's maybe a little bit of faith that comes in, and that's what you talk about in your blog as well. Like, if in 10 years nothing has happened, but you made progress by your own accord, will it have been worth it? And so that's this question of, are you intrinsically motivated?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean that is really where it's at, and I mean I think we're landing squarely in the territory of, I think, another one of the questions you had, which is it reminded me. I think you called it maybe terror management, something like that.
Yeah. I mean,
right.
Maybe it was a bit exaggerated, but
yes and no. I mean, because you hit the nail on the head. Like, right, this is hard. Right? This is really, really hard, and it's really competitive. And I really do think it requires people, when they're getting into it, to ask themselves seriously a couple of questions and to answer honestly, right? And the one is the one you just mentioned, which is, if all of this doesn't work out, and you can put some sort of benchmark in the future, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, and you're not bound to that, but just for the sort of thought experiment value of it, if at some point 10 years from now this hasn't worked out according to like what I define success to be, will it have been worth it? And that question is, it's not easy to answer, and it often requires a lot of introspection, but it also forces you to start really thinking about like, what are the motivations getting people into this, which gets right back to that issue of sustainability that we sort of started off with, in a way. Because if you're not going about this in a manner where you have had some exposure and some breadth, and then you make some sort of realizations about yourself, and you go further, and you start to decide what interests you, and sorry, just tangentially for a second, I think there was this article I found in the Atlantic Monthly called "Find Your Passion is Really Terrible Advice," and I actually loved it, because their point was essentially what I made with talking about excruciating joy. Like, but passion makes it sound like this is all going to be fun, and like we musicians just sit there every day like reveling in the beauty of our own sound and like doing all the stuff, and like, my God, no, it is far from it. Like, it is often a slog, and it is hard, and it is long hours, and your body hurts, and all of this stuff, but it's the kind of rewarding work that I feel in the same way if I do like a really long hike at high altitude, right? My legs are tired, and my feet hurt, and my lungs are burning, but man, the view is amazing, and I'm glad I did it. And so having that kind of sense about why you're doing what you're doing is what can help you answer that question honestly. Like, if this all doesn't work out, it's still going to have been worth it. It will still be worth the time. It's sort of like, if you go on a big hike, and you come down and like you sprain your ankle in like the last half a mile, like, was the hike still worth it? And you're like, well, okay, yeah, you can't always control what happens, and maybe that means you're not going to get to go on another hike for another 6 months, but like, it was still a good hike. It was still a beautiful view, right?
Yeah.
I think about this metaphor a lot of times when encountering like Strauss's Alpine Symphony, right? It's like the most literal sort of musical example of this idea. And like in the Alpine Symphony, there's a thunderstorm, and you get wet, and you're cold, and it's not comfortable. So like this is the thing I think that most effectively confronts that sort of terror management idea that you talked about, because for the people who are gripped by this, who have this existential dread about, oh my God, like, what if this doesn't work out? The answer is, you've dealt with that problem already. Like, you've already accepted that it might not, right? And you've thought about it a lot, and you've got some contingency plans, and you're setting up this process so that you can do this for the long haul. One of the other things I've recently begun focusing a lot more in my teaching with like early college age and even high school students is thinking about this basic reality. At least here in the US, I think way too many music education programs at universities and conservatories, they don't do nearly enough to prepare people for the realities that are going to confront them when they're out of school. Which is to say, you finish a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, or you even stick around for an artist diploma or some sort of certificate or something like that. And you're done with school then when you're like 23, 24, 25, something like that. And great, then what? Right? And as soon as I got to the Met, I ended up overseeing this sort of internal study that we did where we asked the members of our orchestra two questions. And it was, how old were you when you won your audition for the Metropolitan Opera? And how many auditions had you taken at that point? And, unsurprisingly, like happens with surveys like this, you get results that essentially form kind of a bell curve. And you've got outliers on either end. And on the high end, people had taken, 45, 50 auditions and won the job in their 50s. Like, wow, okay, that's tenacity. On the low end, yeah, there were a couple people that won jobs like either straight out of school or while they were in school. It's not that doesn't happen, but it's that is by far an outlier. It is rare. It is not the thing you can count on. And yet, so many people proceed through school as if they're counting on that happening, right? And I'll ask students this all the time. I'm like, great, so what are your plans for after graduation? They're like, well, I'm going to just audition and win a job. It's like, are you? I mean, on average, there's going to be a 4 to 8 year gap in there between when you finish school and you've refined your process enough to win a job, right? And this is not an accident in a way, right? Because like the field continues to get much, much more competitive, and it takes longer to get to the level that you need to be at to be technically and musically competitive in this. Auditioning itself is its own skill. It takes a while to get used to that. And, it's just going to take time. And so the question I want to get my students asking themselves as early on as possible is that, again, accepting that this might not work out, which is not defeatist. It's just, confronting reality as it is. And accepting that if, even if this does work out, it's still going to be likely a multi-year gap between the time I'm done in school and, when I'm good enough and competitive enough to win an audition. So what's my plan? like what am I going to do in the meantime? Right. I think of school as sort of like the research and development lab in a way for your musical training, where like you come up with a prototype, but then you like emerge out into the world and you're like, oh crap. Okay. Now we have to like alpha test this and beta test this and actually get a product that's usable. and that's what you need to bring to an audition. And that's frankly what we're listening for behind the screen is, are you not just like a skilled student, but like a mature, complete musician package, right? And so the question then is like, great, so you're planning to go to school, but then what are you also going to be doing for the 2 to 4 to 8 years after that? And man, it's just really astonishing to me how few people have given that part really, really serious thought. Because, when I press people on it, they're like, yeah, I mean, I get it. Like, I still might need to like keep improving and practicing when I'm out of school, but yeah, I'll figure out a way to do that. And I'm like, okay, but how? Like, what are you going to do? Again, you're going to need to pay the rent somehow, right? And like maybe you have really generous parents, or you have a trust fund, or you can just like live in their basement for 10 years or something. But like that's, again, not the norm. So what's the plan? And it's actually the more I've been teaching and seeing this same problem manifested throughout a generation of younger players, it's made me really reflect upon and appreciate my own experience, which is that at the time, like, I thought I was at a major disadvantage because I had this other job and this like other career. And I was like, oh my God, like I feel kind of distracted by this. Maybe I'm just like not going to be competitive at these auditions. Oh, what am I doing? And, there was a lot of sort of existential doubt and agony and all this other stuff. And yet, my God, like in retrospect, I had a huge advantage going into that because I had a way to make my process sustainable. I could do it for as long as I needed to, right? And I think a lot of people, a lot of the terror management that comes into this is people imposing some sort of arbitrary deadline on themselves, saying like, well, if I haven't won an audition after 30 auditions, or if I haven't won something by the time I turn 30, I'm giving it all up and I'm going back and getting an MBA or doing something totally different. And to me, that's just like, I don't get that at all. That makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, especially considering that this field continues to get more and more competitive, and like that quote unquote finish line, or, the period where you can actually support yourself with your music making, that line is just going to keep getting further and further away from school. And, so it just seems totally insane to me that you'd like impose an arbitrary threshold and then use that threshold to freak yourself out constantly. I think it's much more useful to think about, okay, what can I do to make my process of improving as beneficial and sustainable as possible? And if that involves, having a different form of employment, several different forms of employment, doing a couple of different things, but making sure that, your income is coming from places that still provide you time and space and mental bandwidth to practice, that's the name of the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to see how intent you are on bridging that gap between the reality and.
And look, I mean, like I'm gonna say some stuff now that's like not going to be popular with school administrators, but that's the nice thing about the path I took. Like I have no debt to them. Right? Like I didn't go to a conservatory. I don't owe them anything. It's fine. And I think this cuts the same way in both Europe and the US. The reason the system is like this is that it is not in a music school's business model or best interest to be fully honest about this, right? Like if on the application materials it said, warning, only 5% of you are going to actually do this. Like, there would be a lot fewer people applying. There has to be like a certain amount of sort of optimistic delusion that gets people into this. But I also feel like one of my roles now, and one of the things I want to do in my teaching and writing and everything else, is sort of act as a helpful filter and a little dose of reality. It's not that I want people to quit music. Far from it. I want a lot of people to be involved in music. What I want, though, is for the ones who really decide to make a commitment, like a multi-year, decades-long commitment to the performing arts. I would like those people to be the thoughtful ones, the introspective ones, the ones who have asked themselves the question, if this all doesn't work out, is it still, will it have been worth it anyway? I think the field is going to be better off. I think individual human beings will be better off. And again, the problem is that it's not in schools or conservatory programs' best interests to get people asking those questions. They need to fill their roles. They need to meet their minimum enrollment guidelines. They have bills to pay. They have teachers to pay. And so their priority is keep people coming into the school and paying tuition and get them degrees. And then after that, it's not their problem. And that is not a helpful or, reality-based way to look at what a music career is going to be like. And, the thing is, you don't have the same issue with MBA programs. You don't have the same issues with law degrees, right? And this is simply because like musicians have this, again, this sort of like passion part of it. It might be excruciating joy, but there is this thing where we're like, art is important to us. There's this thing about, great works of music from all these different centuries that reflects something about being human and helps us like contextualize our place in the world. And this speaks to us and is attractive to us in ways that like, reams of like mind-numbing jurisprudence or like financial mergers just isn't. And so you don't have, 10 to 20 times as many people applying for law degrees as there are jobs available. You don't have that same problem with MBAs. And, so those schools don't have to deal with that. Well, that's the situation we face in the performing arts. And, the schools are not going to police themselves. There's never going to be a point where, major music schools and conservatories are saying, well, the jobs just, are not so plentiful out there. So we're only accepting 5% of the people that applied this year. Like it's not going to happen. And so it's really on the individual to make these decisions for themselves, to kind of look at it clear-eyed, to understand what they're getting themselves into, to, be real about it, and then think about what this process is going to look like in the long term.
You said that the traditional notion of talent is dead, referencing the scientific literature and the scientific consensus. However, it seems to be alive and well in culture and in the collective unconscious. And I'd like to have your opinion on why do you think that is, and why is it? Because I've had this conversation with many of my friends and family, and it's crazy to see how much people seem to be attached to this idea of innate talent, like the Mozart myth.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree. It is something where, because this is often an idea I lead with when I'm teaching, because it is so foundational and everything else about my approach and my process and methods and everything else stem from this. I feel like you kind of have to go with that first. But it then also gives me an opportunity to see the sort of inherent pushback and the like, whoa, wait a minute. And people are still, very frequently kind of taken out of their comfort zones by this idea. My answer to this, so there's some of this that is tackled in the literature. Some of it is sort of speculative. Well, here, I'm going to pause for another 20 seconds and just pull up some of the relevant quotes. Yeah. So, for example, page 207 in Peak, Ericsson writes, "It's one of the most enduring and deep-seated of all beliefs about human nature that natural talent plays a major role in determining an ability. But studies of experts point to a quite different explanation, with deliberate practice playing the starring role." And, the question is essentially, why? Like, why is it that this is such a deep-seated idea that goes back, millennia, right? And I think there are a variety of different ways to answer this. I think to a certain extent, and when I talk about the sort of like millennia old thing, you can see in like the earliest epics, the writings, the Iliad and the Odyssey, all of these like classic archetypal myth stories have at their center some sort of hero who is endowed with unnatural abilities and who has a destiny to go do things heroic. And you can be talking about, Achilles. You can be talking about Hercules. You can be talking about Siegfried. You can be talking about Anakin Skywalker, right? This is all the same stuff.
Yeah, maybe that's the hero with 1,000 faces. The book by Joseph Campbell.
Exactly. It's exactly right. It's the same basic story. It is so deeply set in our sort of societal understanding in all of our stories. I mean, so in a way, like the most proximate answer is it's no surprise that people think this, because this is the story they've been told since they've been early enough to know what stories are, right? These are the stories we tell ourselves, and whether it's, again, it could be Luke Skywalker, it could be one of the X-Men. It's like you have a specialness and you were born with this, and you're destined for greatness, right?
Yeah.
I think, though, that there is this dark side of that a lot of people kind of don't really think about when they're absorbing these initial stories, because in a way it stems from the feeling that everybody wants to feel special, right? Everybody is the hero of their own story. And so if you can feel like you're talented too, well, now you're even more the starring actor or actress in your own story, and you are destined for greatness. And, I think the other part of it is it sort of serves as this assurance against the terror management problem, right? Which is like, oh, wow, if I didn't have this talent, if I weren't strong with the force, this whole project would be really scary. But since I know I'm talented, since my midichlorian count is high enough, I know this is all going to work out and it's going to be fine. And so it's sort of it's like a little psychological palliative trick, I think, where people are like, well, I'm desperate to be told I'm talented. And so as long as I'm told that, I'm going to believe that. And that way I can allay the fears that maybe I'm not, or maybe talent isn't even a thing. And maybe like the world is actually fundamentally chaotic and difficult to predict, and you can't know exactly how this is going to turn out. And, because confronting the reality of this is not easy, right? You have to do deep assessments of your values and what you want to be doing and all of this. I think the other side of it, I mean, so there's how that entire framework of thinking can be attractive to people who believe they're talented, or who have, done enough work to develop skills and then have some manifestation of what people would call talent, right? I think the other side of that is that it excuses the people who aren't, which is to say, it gives a total pass. It's an out for people who are not manifesting those skills, or who are not achieving things, or whatever. It's a very easy way to say, well, hey, you didn't really like score so high on that last math test. It's like, yeah, well, I'm like not talented in math. It's just not my thing. Or, man, you really like sucked out there on the soccer field today. Well, I'm just like, I don't have a lot of talent in soccer, right? It's a very easy excuse. And I think, as people like Ericsson have written about, all of this can become incredibly self-fulfilling, right? And one of the most prominent examples of that is actually in Canadian hockey, where you see this in sports all around the world, but where, in Canada, a huge number of the professional hockey players have birthdays between January 1st and middle March. Mm. And you look at this, and on paper, you're like, wait, what's going on here? Like, are people born in those months just like genetically stronger and faster or something? And it's like, no, obviously not. What happens is that the cutoff for like youth hockey league is December 31st. And so if you're born January 1st, you will be the oldest kid on your team. And so the coaches who are coaching, who still likely believe in this old paradigm of talent, they look at all these kids showing up on the ice, and like some of them are skating better than others, and some of them are skating faster than others. And they assume those are the ones that are talented. And so they're like, well, I'm going to give them more like extra training and coaching, and I'm going to put them on the starting team and do all of this. And from this very early age, you get this like bifurcating path system where the kids perceived to have talent get a different route in front of them. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, when in fact it's just a pure quirk of the arbitrary deadline set off to join the league. And And the only reason that matters is because, yeah, when you're like 4 or 5, the difference in 8 or 9 months of growth can make a huge difference in your size, your weight, your speed, your dexterity, all of these other things. And that's not natural talent. That's just how kids grow, and it's random. And, you could design a system totally differently and come up with different results. And, so there's all of these different ways that this talent myth sort of permeates culture. And, we see this from Star Wars and the Iliad and everything else. But then there's also, I think, this almost deeper layer, which is maybe like, why do those myths exist in the first place? And this is now much more just me being speculative and sort of subjectively riffing. But, I think a lot of it can have to do with almost different, like, political cross currents we're seeing in the world right now, in the way technology and social media have enabled these to emerge more strongly. I think there's this very interesting drive toward sort of class inequality that reemerges throughout history in every society all the time. And it could be the French Enlightenment, it could be, medieval agrarianism, or it could be, income inequality in the United States in the 21st century. But nevertheless, you have kind of people at the top who are sucking up all of the resources, and then you have like the great masses of those underneath supporting them. And for the people on top, you want to feel like you deserve it, right? Like you need to not feel guilty about that. And so for a long time, it would, the papacy would give it a sort of religious twist. It's like, well, no, these people have been chosen by God. Or the monarchy would say, well, no, these are the people whose bloodline is, the best to rule the country. And, and more recently, we've gotten the ideas of like, well, no, it's the meritocracy. Like we want to be governed by those who have proven themselves, but they've proven themselves because they're the most talented. And I think in a way, like the deep-seated nature of this almost relates back to then this basic, human fear of death. Like when you have these generational dynasties, like you want to believe that you are going to be sort of immortal through your family, your kids, your dynasty. They have received your genetic gifts and your talents, and they will go on and continue it going, and the name will live, and therefore that's how you confront mortality, right? It's this sort of like generational talent-based immortality. It's a lot tougher to reconcile. Like, oh, it also might be like totally random, and my kids might end up doing totally different things than I do. They might all go into nonprofit work and barely scrape by their entire lives. And 2 or 3 generations from now, they'll be doing things entirely different, right? And so I don't know. I think there are a lot of deep-seated psychological factors that explain how the talent myth, has like Ericsson said, has been one of the most basic understandings of human nature for thousands of years, and is also just provably wrong.
Well, that's a very, very interesting way of seeing it. And actually, while you were talking, I was also thinking that some things that might tend to confirm your thesis might be the idea of predestination in Protestantism or the idea of karma in Hinduism have both been successfully used to enforce this kind of social control where people are, there is a social order and people are where they are because it's been preordained and that's the way it should be. So it's a very, to cite Carol Dweck, that would be the opposite of the growth mindset, right?
Absolutely. Well, and to your point, though, I think it is a very interesting idea that, like, and I can't say this from experience or anything, but I would be very interested to know if the notion of talent like this is as deeply seated in Eastern cultures as in Western cultures, because you're absolutely right. So much of religious doctrine for again, millennia in the West has had these various different ideas of predestination involved in it. Whereas Buddhist ideas are much more process oriented, much less, God has a plan for you. And even the notion of karma itself is a much more sort of deliberate practice idea. Like you gotta do the work to get karma. Like it's all about the process. You do the work, and if you engage in it, then then good things will come to you after that. But you're not born with karma, right? And so like I think your question it points to some basic fundamental differences in how humans have structured their societies and how we think about philosophy and just everything else.
Okay. Well, Jason, one last question for you. Do you find yourself applying deliberate practice in other areas of your life?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. In fact, funny thing, here's the anecdote for the day. I am looking right now in my hand. I have a map of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. It just showed up in the mail yesterday because I'm in the middle of planning a backpacking trip for me and my girlfriend this July. And, for me, the sort of experience of the outdoors and doing these, multi-day treks with everything we need on our backs, our tent, our food, everything else, it's a very interesting corollary to my experience of music and a music career. And there's a lot involved with it that seems, either sort of parallel or like two sides of the same coin. But with specific respect to that, I have approached that. I mean, you could call it a hobby, you could call it a lifestyle, whatever else. But, right around the time I started getting really serious about music, I was getting more deliberate about the way I would do those trips. And it had to do with, keeping very detailed lists of things I was bringing. And then I made a spreadsheet of all those lists. And then I started to go through and weigh with a little gram scale everything that was in my pack. And I would have these different, contingency settings in my spreadsheet to be like, okay, if I'm going to be in this climate, I'm going to need this, and this, but I don't need this other thing. And if I'm going to be in the Rockies, I'm going to need a bear canister, but I'm not going to need this other thing. Right. And it was all about sort of like optimization, efficiency, not bringing any more stuff than I needed, not wasting resources or time or anything, ultimately so that I could have, the most enjoyable possible experience in the backcountry. And, I think for some people, this probably sounds like agonizing. They're like, oh my God, that sounds like a lot of work. Yeah. And you have to be out there and you're out there for days and you're like not showering. And I'm like, yep, okay, fine. It's not for everyone. Just the same way that a music career is not for everyone. I grant that. But for me, I love it. I love the feeling of freedom and independence and self-sufficiency that comes from like, I am in the middle of the wilderness. Everything that I need is on my back. It weighs like less than 30 pounds. So it's not too like physically strenuous. It means that we can, go up higher mountains and not be getting altitude sickness and just all of this other stuff. And I, I'm more comfortable because I've spent the time to like really research like, okay, like what gear is going to be really lightweight, but still, rain repellent and all of this other stuff. So that like, no matter the conditions, we can still get through it and be fine. And I mean, people listening to this might already know where I'm going with this, but like, again, there's like this very parallel idea for the way I think about that, which is, you prepare really well so you can be ready for adversity, and the exact way that I think about a music career.
Oh yeah, but it's also like the multiverse idea that you have
in the last article.
Yeah. There's a whole different. There's a variety of contingencies and ways this can go, but when you've been thoughtful about it and sort of deliberately planning, you've foreseen all of those in advance, and so few things will ever take you totally by surprise, and you know what to do when you see a moose or a bear. Or it's 11 a.m. and a thunderstorm comes across and you're above the tree line. You're like, you know what to do and you can take care of yourself. And there is real strength that comes from that. I mean, there's a lot of confidence that can come from that kind of deliberate planning. And when I'll sometimes have these parts of classes I teach where I just take young musicians and I run them through the statistics, right? And the statistics, start off with saying things like, okay, there's roughly 7,000 to 10,000 music performance degrees granted in the United States every year. Okay, fine. So that's like this pool of people out there against whom you are nominally competing. And then you've got that pool, but of course it's not just the people in that pool. You've also got the people from last year's pool and the people from the pool before that. And so, it's informing this idea of like how truly competitive this thing is. And, and then I walk them through, so you've got these like tens of thousands of people. In the United States, you've got, for instance, 52 ICSOM orchestras. And in the US, these are the orchestras that essentially pay a living wage. It's enough money to live on and you get health benefits, that kind of thing. And with 52 of these orchestras, round up to like roughly 100 people per orchestra. That's a stretch, but still, that's like 5,200 positions. And if you assume that an average length of career is about 30 years, that means that there's only 173 openings per year. But you've also got 7,000 people joining this pool that's increasingly growing from 7,000 to 14,000 to 28,000 to like 60,000 people. And like these statistics can be absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
But, and this is the big but, and this is the really important part, I'm telling them this not to freak them out. I bring this up because it's the same thing I think about when I'm at the Grand Canyon, for instance. I don't know if you've ever been, but in the middle of Arizona, we have like the biggest canyon in the world, right? And you go up to the edge of that, and there's all these warning signs, and don't get too close to the edge, don't do this, and one of the biggest ones is do not attempt to hike down to the Colorado River and back in one day. It's too dangerous. It's too far. It's easy to go down. It's much harder to get back up. And you will probably have to be helicoptered out. You'll get heat stroke. You'll get like heat exhaustion, something. Don't do it. Of course, nevertheless, every day, every year, there are people who show up unprepared, overconfident, not understanding their own preparation or their weaknesses or anything else. And they go down and they get themselves into trouble. And they might be, 23-year-old guys in their peak physical prime, and still they're getting choppered out of the Grand Canyon because they had no idea what they're doing. By contrast, when I was doing a hike there, I saw people in their 80s who were really well prepared, and they did the work, and they were deliberate about it, and they had all the right gear, and they were taking their time, and they were just fine. Right? And so to me, it is really like sort of the ultimate living metaphor of this whole concept that like, yeah, you want to know what you're getting yourself into, but you also know that like this pool of people is not all the same. Like it's actually a fairly small number of people who are going to be disciplined and who are going to be organized and who are going to take the long view and set themselves up to be competitive over a long time, and who are going to make the kinds of choices that will be, increasingly putting them at an advantage, and who are going to really do the work. And so you don't necessarily have to be terrified of the fact that there's like tens of thousands of people competing for these small number of positions when you recognize that it is totally within your power to make the decisions and form your process to be the one of the people that has a really good shot at it.
Yeah, I guess that's the best way to approach this because, as you said, that is both honest and there's a silver lining there.
Yeah.
Well,
and like me
Jason,
too, the silver lining is like, I like to hike. so you'll have a good time along the way no matter what.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. Jason, thanks a million for your time. And yeah.
Thank you.
Got it.
Okay, well, hope you enjoyed the talk, and now it's time for footnotes. Footnote number 0. So there was actually no footnote for this one, but you have to know that the book that looms over this whole conversation is Speak, Secret from the New Science of Expertise by Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole. Footnote number 1. In my first question, I mentioned 2 books written by the professor of computer science, Calvin Newport. The first one is Deep Work, and the second and most recent one is Digital Minimalism, Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. Footnote number 2. Here, Jason refers to the book Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, written by David Epstein. Footnote number 3. The 2 books I'm alluding to here are The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle and Talent is Overrated by Geoff Colvin. And so the idea that I was mentioning is an idea by Daniel Coyle. He observed the Polgar situation where Laszlo Polgar, a Hungarian chess teacher and educational psychologist, decided to educate his 3 daughters so they could become chess champions. And they actually did become grandmasters. So he was trying to prove that talent was not born, but that it was bred. And the interesting thing is that the 3rd sister, so the little sister, Judith Polgar, was much better in competitive chess than her sisters, and actually she became grandmaster at the young age of 15, which was a complete record at the time. And so Daniel Coyle tries to extrapolate on this anecdotal evidence, and he found that on average, Olympic champion sprinters are 4th in families of 4.6 children. And that seems to corroborate his point as far as the necessity of having a supportive environment is concerned when trying to achieve peak performance. Footnote number 4. The book in question is The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century by Alex Ross, and I first heard of it on Jason's blog. Footnote number 5. So here I'm struggling to find terminology from the book Range. The correct terminology is kind environments versus wicked environments. The idea being that in kind environments, you get straightforward feedback as opposed to the more sticky situations in wicked environments. Footnote number 6. On May 6th, 1954, in Oxford, Roger Bannister ran the first mile in less than 4 minutes, and he ran it in 3 minutes and 59.4 seconds while he was practicing as a junior doctor. His record lasted just 46 days, even though before he did that, it was considered physically impossible to run a mile in under 4 minutes. And so that evokes, at least for me, the research of Martin Seligman, the psychologist, on learned helplessness. The idea being, in a nutshell, that when people, or animals for that matter, are convinced that something is impossible, they don't even try to do it. So it's a way to stress the importance of the narrative that one tells oneself. Footnote number 7. The Hero with 1,000 Faces is a book first published in 1949 by Joseph Campbell, and it's a work of comparative mythology in which the author discusses his theory that there is a mythological structure that repeats and that can be found everywhere. And it's very rooted in psychoanalysis, and of course we can discuss it and argue with it, but it's been seminal, and for example, it has notoriously influenced George Lucas when he was writing Star Wars and building the character of Luke Skywalker. Footnote number 8. So here Jason is referencing research by Huxley, Lyer and Trax, published in 2001 and called A Proposal to Reduce the Age Discrimination in Canadian Minor Hockey. Footnote number 9. So here I feel like I must clarify a little bit what I meant. So there is on the one hand the doctrine of predestination, or even double predestination with Protestantism, but there is also the idea of karma that I was mentioning, and in that case what I was actually referring to is samsara, because karma, and I want to put a disclaimer right here because I'm really not an expert on these subjects, but karma is the belief that one's deeds in the present affects one's future, and samsara is essentially the same thing as far as future lives are concerned. So for example, to tie it to the context in which I was saying it, the idea is that, for example, that if you have a perceived gift in a specific domain, it might be due to your samsara and to the fact that the people that came before you in the cycle of reincarnation did some good deeds. And the idea of social control and social rules in the conversation that we have would be commensurate with the idea of dharma, which is the laws of the universe or the right way of living. It has no direct translation in English. And dharma is famously discussed in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a dialogue between Prince Arjuna and Krishna, a dialogue that happens on a battlefield, and there they discuss what would be the right course of action to follow in the dilemma in which Arjuna finds himself, because he's debating whether or not he should fight with his relatives. And him and Krishna are discussing, among other things, what the Dharma dictates in that case, and how does it relate to his caste, etc. So did Arjuna fight with his family or not? No spoilers. And I actually recommend you read the Bhagavad Gita for yourself. It's a very interesting read. And finally, footnote number 10. Carol S. Dweck is a professor of psychology at Stanford, and she is known for her work on the mindset psychological trait. However, it seems like a lot of her research is not replicable, which diminishes the epistemic value of her claims. So yeah, that was it. Thank you for your attention. I must reiterate and say that I'm really grateful that Jason agreed and took the time to participate. His articles really have had a big influence on my thinking about practice, and I really admire his passion, his grit, and how eloquent and enthralling he is when he's sharing his experience with others. And as always, if you learn something, I would appreciate your supporting me by liking, commenting, and don't hesitate to share the podcast with your friends if you think that it might be of interest to them. That was Baptiste Vattiez for the Cross-Pollination Podcast, and that's all for now.